Every tick was perfect until time itself ran out. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. I'm curious. What part of the world are you solving this from today? Your messages keep this channel ticking. Let's get to it. The little village of Flaxborough prided itself on its tranquility. Tucked away amidst the rolling meadows of the West Country, it was the sort of place where one could still hear birdsong over the chime of the church bells, where the hedgerows bloomed dutifully in spring, and where time itself seemed content to move a touch slower than elsewhere. It was a village of routines and rituals, of freshly baked bread from the bakery each morning, of postman Jenkins whistling along the high street, and of the steadfast tick of the grandfather clock in the window of Mortimer Finch's shop. Flaxborough's resident clockmaker. Mr. Finch was a peculiar sort of man, neither especially warm nor particularly cold. A bachelor of advancing years, he had lived above his shop for as long as anyone could remember, tending to timepieces with a quiet devotion. Some villagers thought him rather dull, others admired his meticulous ways. Children found his collection of cuckoo clocks fascinating, and more than one visitor had paused to gaze through the dusty window at the great antique clocks that lined the walls. Mortimer Finch, however, did not encourage interruptions. He kept his life as tightly wound as the springs inside his clocks, which is why it caused such a stir when, on the morning of St. Luke's Day, the bells failed to chime from the tower of St. Jude's Church, and the old man's shop remained shuttered long past its usual opening hour. Mrs. Weatherby, who prided herself on walking her terrier precisely at 7:15 each morning, was the first to notice. She stopped in front of the darkened shop front, peering at her reflection in the glass, and then at the still, silent clocks behind it. None moved. Not a tick, not a tock. Odd, she muttered to Bixby, the terrier. Very odd. By 10 o'clock, word had spread up the high street and down the hill toward the vicarage. Postman Jenkins reported that there had been no reply when he knocked that morning. Miss Greta Pym, the organist's niece, swore she saw a flicker of candlelight in the upstairs window the night before, or perhaps it was a lantern, the sort with a shade, flickering dreadfully. By 10:30, Constable Riggs had been fetched from the station. He knocked politely, then he knocked again less politely. When no answer came, he conferred with Dr. Meredith and, after some deliberation, forced the side door open with the help of a reluctant butcher's apprentice named Thomas. What they found inside stopped them cold. Mortimer Finch lay in his workroom, slumped over the wide oak table where he repaired. His clocks, his spectacles were perched on the bridge of his nose, a delicate gear wheel clutched between two gloved fingers. The expression on his face was oddly serene, almost as if he had dozed off mid-tinkering. But it was the stillness, the dreadful, unnatural stillness, that betrayed the truth. The grandfather clock behind him had stopped at precisely 11:41. There was no blood, no sign of violence. But Dr. Meredith, after a few minutes and a furrowed brow, quietly announced that Mr. Finch had not died a natural death. Something, he said, had stopped more than just the clocks in that shop. By noon, the village was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Every tea shop, bakery, and post office corner was alive with theories. Poison, some whispered. A heart attack, others insisted, though Dr. Meredith had shaken his head most firmly. Miss Pamela Long, the vicar's young housekeeper, claimed to have heard an argument near the shop the night before. Mr. Simmons, the greengrocer, said Mortimer had seemed troubled the previous week, though when pressed, he admitted he might have only imagined it. And at that very moment, seated beneath the ivy-covered veranda of the Bluebell cottage, Miss Jane Marple gently stirred a second spoonful of sugar into her tea. Her soft blue eyes looked out across her rose garden, unfocused, but very much alert. She had, quite by chance, passed Mr. Finch's shop just the afternoon before, and something quite small but quietly peculiar had caught her attention. She took a sip of tea and frowned ever so slightly. Clocks did not stop without reason, and men like Mortimer Finch rarely made mistakes. The news of Mortimer Finch's death spread through Flaxborough faster than the church bell ever could have summoned the faithful. By tea-time, every cottage kitchen and garden gate had become a forum for speculation. And with no definitive word from the authorities, only the vague, unsettling statement from Dr. Meredith that the clockmaker had not died naturally, the villagers were left to fill in the details themselves, a task they undertook with the enthusiasm of amateur sleuths and long-practiced gossips. At the Hare and Hen, the local public house, a group of old-timers gathered earlier than usual, their pints untouched as they huddled near the fireplace. Mr. Jeffers, who had once served in the Home Guard and now fancied himself an expert in matters of suspicious behaviour, leaned in close to mutter, "Mark my words, it's poison. Always is when there's no mess. Quiet sort of killing, that is. And Finch was just the sort to be poisoned. Clockmakers aren't popular, you know, always fiddling, knowing the time better than anyone else." Except he never bothered, no. "One," muttered old Mudge, who'd once sold Mortimer apples from his orchard. Kept to himself. A quiet man, yes, but not unfriendly. Polite, paid in exact change. "You can be polite and still be hiding something," Jeffers replied darkly. Meanwhile, outside the bakery, Mrs. Elsie Weatherby, Bixby tugging at her leash impatiently, recounted to a small crowd the morning's discovery for what must have been the fourth time. All the clocks had stopped, not just one, and perfectly too. 11:41, every one of them. Now tell me that isn't queer. "It's chilling," agreed Miss Greta Pym, hugging her woolen shawl closer around her narrow shoulders. "I always thought there was something a bit spectral about all those clocks ticking at once, as if time had too many mouths." At that moment, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Edith Langford, approached with a tray of scones for the bake sale that was to be held that Saturday, pending, of course, the state of village morale. "Do stop filling your heads with nonsense," she chided gently. "Poor Mr. Finch likely had a weak heart. All these fanciful theories, one might think you'd rather it were murder." But the truth was they would, or at least they couldn't help but be thrilled by the possibility. Flaxborough, despite its tranquil appearance, had always harboured a secret fondness for drama, so long as it happened to someone else. Miss Marple, however, kept to herself. She had paid a quiet visit to the churchyard that morning, ostensibly to check on the late bloomers in the west-facing border, but also, truthfully, to hear what she might overhear. Her wide-brimmed straw hat and serene expression made her nearly invisible to the loquacious, who barely paused in their chatter as she passed. What she gathered was not the words so much as the tone beneath them. People were not merely shocked, they were uneasy. Mortimer Finch, a man long considered one of Flaxborough's most predictable inhabitants, had suddenly become a mystery. That disturbed the village more than his death. Later that day, at the invitation of Dr. Meredith, Inspector Crispin Leach arrived from the nearby market town of Berwick-upon-Windle. Leach was a lean, hawk-faced man with a reputation for swift conclusions and a particular dislike of interference from what he termed domestic observers, a term that included everyone from curious housemaids to, most pointedly, Miss Marple herself. He stood in Mortimer Finch's shop that afternoon, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the workbench and its clutter of gears, springs and delicate screwdrivers. The constable, young Riggs, stood nearby, hat in hand. No signs of struggle, Leach said, scanning the space with narrowed eyes. Door was locked from inside, no forced entry, yet the man is dead, and not, according to your doctor, from anything nature intended. Doctor says there were no visible injuries, Riggs offered. But he was pale, very pale, like wax. Leach grunted. Poison, perhaps? You were right to call me. I'll want his tea set tested, anything he ate. You'll need to make inquiries. Who saw him last? Who came to the shop in the last week? Yes, sir, Riggs nodded. And while you're at it, dig a little into his affairs. Quiet men often have secrets. They're simply better at hiding them. From across the street, Miss Marple watched the inspector emerge from the shop, his notebook tucked under one arm. He did not notice her. Few people ever did, at least not until it was too late to change what they'd already revealed in her presence. She smiled faintly to herself. Mortimer Finch had always been tidy. He wore gloves while working, handled tools with reverence, and once scolded young Johnny Weatherby for smudging the glass of his front display, and yet, in the photo that had been shown around by Constable Riggs earlier, taken of the body in situ, Miss Marple had noticed something quite strange. A smudge. Not on glass, but on the edge of Finch's shirt cuff. Faint, as if made by someone, brushing against him with oily fingers. Curious indeed. She sipped her tea thoughtfully that evening, seated in her favourite armchair, the fire crackling as dusk fell across the village. She was not one to leap to conclusions. Life had taught her that things were never as they first appeared, especially in a place like Flaxborough, where civility masked old grievances and respectability was often used as a curtain to hide unpleasant truths. The next morning she planned to pay a visit to Miss Beadle, the spinster who ran the lending library and who, according to village rumour, had once been more than fond of Mortimer Finch, though neither had married. Miss Beadle had a habit of feigning disinterest in all things emotional, but she possessed an excellent memory for small details and a soft spot for anyone who asked her questions in the language of books. And if Miss Marple knew anything, it was how to make questions sound like innocent meanderings, especially when the answers might lead to murder. Outside, the church bell finally rang again, long delayed, solemn in tone. It struck the hour, 6 chimes, then fell silent once more, as if uncertain whether time ought to proceed. But Miss Marple, watching the shadows lengthen across her garden, knew better. Time had never stopped at all. It had merely waited for someone to notice what others missed. The following morning dawned misty and cool, with the sort of dampness that clung to hedgerows and made even the most well-swept garden paths feel slightly sinister. Flaxborough seemed subdued, its usual hum of morning activity muffled beneath a hush that spoke of more than weather. Shopkeepers opened their doors a little slower, and even Postman Jenkins, who whistled through most inconveniences, kept his tune in a minor key. Miss Marple took her breakfast promptly at 8, soft-boiled egg, toast with marmalade, and a small pot of Darjeeling, and dressed in a dove-grey coat with a pale blue scarf before setting off toward the Flaxborough Lending Library. She carried with her a worn copy of the Forsyte Saga, which she had no intention of discussing, and a small tin of shortbread, which she very much did. The library was a converted chapel on the edge of the village green, its arched windows now filled with leaded glass etched with scenes of pastoral wisdom. A shepherd with a book, a cow reading scripture. Inside it smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Behind the front desk sat Miss Beadle, thin and angular, her white hair pulled into a taut bun, spectacles perched like tiny birds on the tip of her nose. "Well," she said, barely glancing up, "I assume you've come for more Galsworthy. Though why anyone wants to read about unhappy marriages I can't imagine." "Oh, I'm rather fond of his observations," Miss Marple said cheerfully, handing over the book. "He reminds me of people I knew in my youth. Besides, it's rather comforting, don't you think? All that restraint and bitterness," Miss Beadle sniffed. "If you say so." They stood in silence for a moment before Miss Marple produced the tin. "I baked yesterday, ginger shortbread. My niece insists I ought to stop making them, but I always think ginger helps one think more clearly." At that, Miss Beadle's gaze lifted. "Well, thinking's certainly in short supply lately." Miss Marple didn't respond at once. She opened the tin and placed it on the desk, then delicately selected a biscuit for herself. "You must have known Mr. Finch quite, well, being neighbours in thought, so to speak." A flicker of something passed over Miss Beadle's face, gone as soon as it appeared. Mortimer was a customer, reliable. He borrowed biographies mostly, had a particular interest in naval history. "Oh," said Miss Marple, eyes bright. "Was he ever in the Navy?" "No, not that I ever heard. He served in the war, of course, but that was the Home Guard. Still, he liked structure, punctuality." She hesitated. "And rules." Miss Marple nodded as if this were only natural. "Did he have friends, would you say?" Miss Beadle gave a short laugh, though it held no amusement. "He wasn't the sort. He was meticulous, kept to himself. If he had friends, they didn't live in Flaxborough." Miss Marple let the silence settle, then said almost absently, "It must have been such a shock, finding him like that." Another pause. "I didn't find him," Miss Beadle said cautiously. "No, of course not. I meant for the village, generally. The idea that someone could die like that, quietly, right at their workbench." Miss Beadle shifted in her chair. "He would have hated it, the fuss being talked about." "Do you think anyone hated him?" Miss Beadle blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Forgive me, I phrased that poorly," Miss Marple said with a modest smile. "I meant, was there anyone with reason to dislike him? Not violently, of course, just quietly." Miss Beadle pursed her lips. "Well, there was the matter with the Beckets." Miss Marple waited patiently. "Harold and Cynthia Beckett," Miss Beadle explained. "They ran the antique shop on Hatherley Lane until last spring. They and Mr. Finch had a falling out, something about a grandfather clock he was repairing. For them it was a valuable piece, apparently. When they came to collect it, they claimed he'd damaged the inlay." "Oh dear." "Yes, well, it got quite heated. The Beckets left town not long after, sold the shop and moved to Bath, I believe. But Harold swore he'd never forgive Finch for the ruin of his investment, called him a charlatan. I always thought that was a touch dramatic. Did Mr. Finch ever respond to the accusations?" "No, he said very little. Just stopped dealing with them. That was his way. Silence as a form of defence." Miss Marple sat back, gently tapping one finger on the tin. "I do wonder, indeed, when a man surrounds himself with clocks, what is it he's really trying to control?" Miss Beadle raised an eyebrow. "Time, I should think." Miss Marple gave a soft laugh. "Oh, yes, but time doesn't always obey." She took her leave shortly afterward, offering thanks and leaving the remaining shortbread behind. As she stepped back onto the damp pavement, the village felt somehow smaller, its houses closer, its secrets nearer to the surface. As she passed by the churchyard, she spotted young Thomas Carroway, the butcher's apprentice who'd helped force the door open that fateful morning. He was hunched on a bench, flicking pebbles into the grass with a distracted air. "Good morning, Thomas," she called gently. He startled, then nodded. "Miss Marple? You look as though you've seen a ghost." He gave a half-hearted shrug. "I just keep seeing him, Mr. Finch, all folded over like that." "It was brave of you to go in," he hesitated. "It didn't feel brave, it felt wrong." Miss Marple sat beside him, smoothing her skirt. "How do you mean?" "I don't know." He rubbed the back of his neck. Everything was too still, like the air had stopped moving. And the clocks, all those clocks not ticking, it was like walking into a room where something had happened, but you didn't know what, but you felt it. She studied his face for a moment, then said, "Did anything seem out of place?" He looked at her, surprised. "You mean other than him being dead?" Other than that, Thomas thought. There was a teacup, still warm, but the saucer was missing. Isn't that odd? "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Yes, it is." She patted his arm and left him there, her thoughts spinning faster than any watch mechanism in Mortimer Finch's collection. A missing saucer, a soiled cuff, an argument over a clock. Small details all. But Miss Marple knew that people revealed themselves not in what they showed, but in what they failed to hide. And someone, somewhere in Flaxborough, was trying very hard to hide something. By the time Inspector Leach called a public meeting in the village hall, the autumn chill had well and truly settled in. Outside, the wind ruffled the hedges and scattered golden leaves across the cobbled lanes. Inside, however, the air was warm with anticipation and more than a little anxiety. It wasn't often the village of Flaxborough gathered for a matter of criminal concern, and certainly not one involving the death of a man as unassuming as Mortimer Finch. Miss Marple arrived early, naturally, and took a seat in the second row, not so close as to be conspicuous, but close enough to observe. She wore a simple woolen coat and gloves and carried a neat handbag from which protruded the corner of a shopping list she had no intention of using. The inspector stood at the front, straight-backed and severe, with Constable Riggs hovering behind him like a nervous shadow. A chalkboard had been wheeled in, left over from the children's Sunday scripture classes, and someone had scrawled, "Notice to public matters of inquiry" across it in block letters. "Ladies and gentlemen," Leach began, clearing his throat, "I thank you for your cooperation. As you are all aware, Mr. Mortimer Finch passed away 2 mornings ago under circumstances we are now treating as suspicious. Preliminary findings have not yielded a cause of death, but I am assured by Dr. Meredith that poison is a likely candidate. We are currently awaiting toxicology confirmation." A soft murmur rose from the audience, more of confirmation than surprise. Poison was, after all, the village's leading theory. "I'm not here to cause alarm," Leach continued, "but to ask for your assistance. Mr. Finch was a solitary man, yes, but no one lives without contact. If anyone saw or spoke to Mr. Finch in the 24 hours prior to his death, I encourage you to come forward now." A silence fell. Then, tentatively, a hand was raised near the back. It belonged to Miss Pamela Long, the vicar's housekeeper, who stood up with a certain tremble to her posture. "I saw someone near his shop," she said, "the night before, around 10, I think. I was coming back from cleaning the vestry. It was a tall man wearing a hat. He came out of the alleyway beside the shop and hurried off toward the green." "Could you see his face?" Leach asked. "No, sir, but he was walking quickly, purposefully." "Thank you, Miss Long." The inspector jotted it down. Miss Marple watched Pamela's expression carefully. The girl was nervous, but not dramatic. Her voice had not trembled from invention. She had seen something, that much was clear. But who? Then a second voice, firmer, spoke from the left side of the room. "I went to see Mr. Finch 2 days before his death." All heads turned to see Mr. Donald Pratt, the solicitor who kept offices above the bank. He adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "I'd taken him a pocket watch belonging to a client. Old piece. He promised to examine it by week's end." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Leach asked. Pratt hesitated. "Well, He seemed distracted. More than usual, I mean. He was looking over some large mechanism, an ornate clock with a pendulum, but he didn't seem focused. He asked me to repeat myself twice. Was anyone else in the shop? No. Leach made another note. Anyone else? At this, Greta. Pym, her grey shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, stood with a certain righteous determination. I'll say it plainly, he had enemies. Maybe not the sort who shouted in public, but enemies nonetheless. There was that business with the Becketts, and before that, he had that row with Archie Frobisher. A collective murmur followed her.
Words. Frobisher? Asked Leach. The schoolteacher? Yes, Greta said.
Archie brought him a French mantel clock 3 months ago, wanted it repaired by a deadline, some family wedding. Finch told him he'd have to wait. Archie took it as a personal insult. Miss Marple remembered this incident. The village had buzzed about it briefly. Frobisher had muttered at the pub about arrogant tradesmen and old men clinging to their little empires. But surely that was not murder-worthy. As Leach scribbled names into his notebook, he looked up. We'll be interviewing Mr. Frobisher directly. Thank you. After the meeting broke up, clusters of people lingered in whispered discussion. Miss Marple waited until most had gone before approaching the inspector. Forgive me, Inspector Leach, she said gently. But may I trouble you for a word? Leach stiffened but nodded. Miss Marple, I hesitate to intrude, but I wonder if I might suggest a line of inquiry? He looked at her warily. You have information? Nothing more than observations, she said. For example, I wonder if anyone has found the saucer. Leach blinked. I'm sorry, the saucer? Yes. I was told by young Thomas Carroway that a teacup was found warm on the workbench, but no saucer with it. I found that curious. Mortimer Finch was rather precise. I cannot imagine him misplacing it. Leach pursed his lips. You believe it was taken? I believe it might have held something powdery perhaps. Or it was taken because it showed something it shouldn't. A thumbprint, say, a residue. Leach's brow furrowed. Thank you, Miss Marple, I'll look into it. He turned away before she could add another word, but she didn't mind. Planting a seed was often enough. That afternoon, as the village resumed its tentative rhythms, Inspector Leach paid a visit to Archie Frobisher. The schoolmaster's cottage was tidy but cluttered with books. Frobisher himself was tall, stooped, and bespectacled. His hands trembled faintly when he poured tea. Yes, I brought him a clock, Frobisher said after initial pleasantries, but I hardly murdered the
man over it. We had a disagreement, certainly, but no more than that. He was a perfectionist, and I was impatient.
Where were you on the night of October 17th? At home, marking papers, alone. Would anyone be able to confirm that? Frobisher sighed. No. Leach eyed the teacup in Frobisher's hand, then glanced around the room. A small fireplace, bookshelves, nothing out of place. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her own tea, rereading a letter from her friend Mrs. Amy Bellingham in Exeter. A name stood out, Cynthia Beckett, mentioned in passing as having recently attended an auction house sale. Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully. Cynthia Beckett, scorned by Mortimer Finch, gone from Flaxborough, yet now appearing, again, in the periphery. And if the Beckett clock had indeed been damaged, what if Finch hadn't merely spoiled an heirloom, but exposed a forgery, a secret, or worse, a deception worth killing to keep buried? Outside the wind howled through. The hedgerows and the village lights flickered on, one by one. The day had yielded more questions than answers. But Miss Marple, in her quiet and unhurried way, had begun to see the pattern. And she knew from long experience that once a pattern began to take shape, the truth, however dark, was never far behind. It was on the third day following Mortimer Finch's death that Miss Marple decided to pay a most deliberate visit to his shop. The police had completed their initial examination, and though the premises remained locked, Constable Riggs had agreed, after only a slight hesitation, to accompany her for a second look. Strictly unofficial, of course. Miss Marple had a way of asking that made refusals seem both ungentlemanly and entirely impossible. "Thank you, Constable," she said, as they stood at the threshold. "I've always believed one should look at a man's surroundings before looking at his motives. A person's things tell stories they rarely say aloud." Inside, the clock shop was just as she'd remembered it, dim and thick with the smell of wood polish and brass. Dozens of clocks lined the walls and shelves, ornate French mantel clocks, tall grandfather clocks, delicate carriage clocks, even a curious little novelty clock in the shape of a cat whose tail ticked back and forth. All of them were silent now. Miss Marple moved slowly through the shop, her gloved hands clasped behind her back. She paused at the central workbench where Mortimer Finch had been found. The tools were still neatly arranged. Tiny screwdrivers, tweezers, a magnifying lens, and there was the teacup, now long cold, but still no saucer in sight. Riggs, hovering awkwardly, gestured toward the hearth. "That's where we found the cup, just there, still warm, like I said," Miss Marple knelt beside the workbench, examining the wooden floorboards. "May I?" she asked. And before Riggs could answer, she gently pressed against one of the floor planks with the end of her cane. To her mild satisfaction, it gave slightly loose. She set down her handbag, removed her gloves, and delicately pried at the edge. With a faint creak, the board lifted. Inside the narrow space beneath was a cloth bundle. She exchanged a glance with Riggs, who looked deeply unsettled. Carefully, she unwrapped it. Inside were two items, a small engraved silver disc, about the size of a pocket watch face, and a folded envelope, yellowed with age, bearing no address, but sealed with wax. She passed the disc to Riggs, who turned it over. "Looks like a clock plate," he said uncertainly. "It is," Miss Marple replied, "but not from a working timepiece. This is ornamental, decorative rather than functional. You see the engraving?" She pointed to a finely etched monogram near the centre. "C.B. Cynthia Beckett," Riggs muttered. "You think it's hers?" "I think Mr. Finch found something he wasn't meant to find," she said softly. And perhaps this was his way of hiding it until he could decide what to do. She tucked the envelope into her handbag, not opening it just yet. Some things were best read with tea and quiet. By the time she returned to her cottage, dusk had begun to gather once more. She lit a fire, placed the envelope on the table, and poured herself a steadying cup of chamomile. Only then did she unseal the wax. Inside were 2 pages of tightly written notes in Mr. Finch's hand. The first contained a series of measurements and references to various timepieces, names, dates, and valuations. The second was more personal, to whom it may concern, I believe. "I have been deceived in a matter of restoration. The grandfather clock delivered to me by Cynthia and Harold Beckett is, in my estimation, a forgery. The inlay is artificial, the mechanisms borrowed from multiple makers, none matching the case.
In age or origin, I suspect the Becketts knew this.
I have consulted 2 sources, one in Bath and one in London. Both confirm my suspicions. I have not yet decided whether to confront them directly. I fear retaliation, for I have the feeling this clock was to be sold under the premise of historical provenance. I have retained a component with their initials which does not belong to the clock, but may tie it to another deception entirely. Should anything happen to me, I implore you to look to the clock and to Cynthia Beckett." Miss Marple folded the letter and sat back. The case was beginning to take on a darker, sharper shape. If Mortimer Finch had uncovered a fraud, a potentially lucrative one, it would explain the motive. Cynthia Beckett, having already left Flaxborough under a cloud, might have returned in secret or sent someone in her place. That tall figure Pamela Long had seen in the lane. Miss Marple retrieved her address book and made a brief call to her friend Amy Bellingham in Exeter, who thankfully answered on the second ring. "Yes, dear," Amy said. "Cynthia's been quite active on the auction scene lately. Attended a sale in Totnes last week. Word is she's got a French Baroque collection on consignment somewhere in Surrey." "Do you happen to have an address?" "I do. Hang on. Here we are. Redfern, House, Eastbourne Road, Surrey." Miss Marple thanked her and rang off. The next morning she sent a letter, short, polite and carefully worded, addressed to Mrs. Cynthia Beckett, inquiring about a particular clock that had once belonged to a family named Lamson and had allegedly been in the Beckett's possession. She signed it not as Jane Marple, but under a false name, Mildred Haythorne, a collector of rare timepieces with a keen interest in early Victorian craftsmanship. It was always wise to see how a person responded to something they thought no one else knew. In the meantime, Inspector Leach had begun to circle back toward his original suspect, Archie Frobisher. Though lacking in a clear motive, Frobisher had opportunity, no alibi, and a history of irritation with the late Mr. Finch. "You seem more nervous now than you did before," Leach said during their second interview. "I am nervous," Frobisher replied, "because I know what this village is like. Once people start pointing fingers, they don't stop until someone's carted off, and I had nothing to do with it." "Did you ever speak to the Becketts?" Leach asked suddenly. Frobisher blinked. "No, why would I?" "Because their names keep coming up," Leach said, "and I find it curious that Mr. Finch mentioned them more than once in his private correspondence." "Private correspondence?" "Just answer the question." "No," Frobisher said stiffly. "I didn't know them well, only that they left suddenly. Rumour was they'd been swindled, but knowing Harold, it was probably the other way round." That night, Miss Marple received a reply by post. The handwriting was elegant, the letter short. "Dear Miss Haythorne, I regret to inform you that the clock in question was sold privately some months ago and is no longer traceable. I fear we cannot be of assistance. Best regards, Mrs. Cynthia Beckett." No further details. No questions, no hint of curiosity. Miss Marple, gently folding the letter, murmured aloud, "How very tidy of her." Outside, the clock at St. Jude's struck midnight, 12 clean chimes echoing across the rooftops. Time was ticking once again in Flaxborough, but the question remained, for whom? It was an unseasonably warm afternoon when Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Dr. Meredith. The sun filtered through the autumn leaves in shafts of gold, but Flaxborough felt no less unsettled for it. Rumours continued to ripple beneath the surface, subtle as ever, yet present in every exchanged glance, every cautious pause in conversation. The doctor's surgery, housed in an ivy-covered Georgian cottage just off the main lane, smelled of antiseptic and old leather-bound books. Dr. Meredith, a man of kind eyes and clipped speech, ushered Miss Marple in with polite curiosity. "I assume this is not a medical visit," he said, offering her a seat beside a window framed by geraniums. "No," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "Though I dare say murder affects the nerves, I find it helps to speak plainly when something weighs on the mind." Dr. Meredith gave a soft chuckle. "I've always admired your instincts, Miss Marple. So tell me, what have you observed?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. Only that Mr. Finch's death does not feel impulsive. It has the shape of something planned, quietly, coldly. He was not a man surrounded by passion or drama, and yet someone wanted him silenced, and they wanted it to look like nothing at all. The doctor folded his arms, leaning against the window-sill. "You suspect poison."
As I do? Oh, yes.
"Though I imagine it was something subtle. Digitalis, perhaps, or aconite. Something that could pass unnoticed unless one were looking very closely." Dr. Meredith nodded. There were no visible signs. His expression was calm. There was some tightening of the jaw muscles, unusual. If I hadn't known him to be a man of routine, I might have attributed it to natural causes. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "But you did know, and you knew he would never have accepted a cup of tea without a saucer." The doctor blinked. "The saucer? That's hardly—" "Unimportant," she interrupted gently. "Not to a man like Mortimer Finch. He did nothing without precision, which means someone else brought him tea that day, and they took the saucer away." Dr. Meredith looked at her with new interest. "So you think the poison was delivered that way?" "I think," she said, rising to her feet, "someone came under the guise of friendship or perhaps reconciliation, and Mr. Finch, suspecting nothing, welcomed them in." She left him in quiet thought and turned her steps toward the church, where she found the vicar's wife, Mrs. Langford, arranging chrysanthemums at the altar. "Forgive me, Edith," Miss Marple said, her tone as casual as if she were asking after the hymn schedule. "But you knew Cynthia Beckett quite well, didn't you?" Mrs. Langford turned, startled. "Well, yes. Before she left, we served on the flower rota together." "Why?" "I was curious. Did she ever mention what she did before coming to Flaxborough?" "Mrs." Langford considered. "Not often. I believe she said she worked in an auction house in London, had a flair for antiques, or so she claimed." Miss Marple smiled. That would explain her knowledge of clocks. "She and her husband always struck me as a little ambitious," the vicar's wife added delicately. "A touch too eager to be well thought of. Harold once hinted he had a relative in the Sechtier peerage. Turned out it was a third cousin who married a baronet's nephew. Social climbing can be tiresome," Miss Marple said, "especially when built on shaky ground." She paused before asking, almost absently, "Did they ever quarrel with anyone? Beyond Mortimer Finch?" Mrs. Langford gave a small laugh. "Oh, they quarrelled with everyone, quietly, of course. Cynthia had a sharp tongue, and Harold a thin skin. I recall an incident with poor Mrs. Pym accused her of damaging a rare snuff-box during a garden party when she'd barely touched the table. That was shortly before they left." "Did they leave abruptly?" Mrs. Langford hesitated. "Yes, very. One day they were arranging for a charity raffle. The next, their shop was shuttered, and they were gone. No farewell, no forwarding address. That evening, Miss Marple sat with the folded letter from Cynthia Beckett beside her teacup. Her eyes lingered on the careful, cautious script, the absence of warmth. It had been a deliberate dismissal, wrapped in politeness. There had been no curiosity, no inquiry as to who Miss Haythorn might be, or why she was asking about the clock. Only a quiet, calculated wall. And walls, Miss Marple knew, were most often built by the guilty. Meanwhile, in the pub that evening, Inspector Leach continued to circle his net around Archie Frobisher, who was beginning to fray under the pressure. "I had no reason to kill him," he barked, slamming his pint on the table. "I didn't even like the man, but that's not a crime." "No, but visiting him the night before he died might be," Leach said calmly. "I didn't visit him. A witness says she saw someone matching your description near his shop." Frobisher paled. "What? No, who? That could have been anyone. Tall, hat, walking toward the green. I wasn't there. You've no alibi? No, Frobisher admitted, his voice quieter now. Because I was at home, alone, but I swear to you, Inspector, I didn't go near that shop. Across the village, Miss Marple had a very different sort of conversation. She stood at the threshold of Miss Beadle's modest cottage, clutching a small tin of lemon biscuits. You again, Miss Beadle said with an arch of her brow. Another craving for literary melodrama? No, not today, Miss Marple said with a warm smile. Today, I've come to ask about a box. Miss Beadle blinked. A box? Yes, a small lacquer box. Cynthia Beckett accused you of damaging it once, at a garden party. I imagine that, was quite humiliating. Miss Beadle's lips tightened. She embarrassed me publicly, yes. It was absurd. I never touched the wretched thing. I'm sure you didn't, but it gave her a reason to behave badly, and you never
Forgot. I'm not a fool, Miss Marple. Of course not. Which is why I wondered whether, in all your careful cataloguing, you ever noticed anything off about the Beckett's collection? Miss Beadle hesitated. She once showed me a pocket
watch, claimed it had belonged to Queen Charlotte. I asked for provenance. She changed the subject. That told me all I needed to know. Forged? Without question, Miss Marple offered the tin. Biscuit? Miss Beadle took one, still watching her. What are you suggesting? That Mortimer Finch saw through the same lie, Miss Marple said softly. And that someone, perhaps Cynthia herself, couldn't afford for that truth to be exposed. The spinster librarian's eyes narrowed. She was back in the village last week. Miss Marple's heart gave a tiny skip. Are you certain? She came into the shop, wore a scarf and large sunglasses, but I knew her voice. She asked about train schedules. I said nothing at the time. Did you mention this to the police? I didn't think it mattered. Until now, Miss Marple stood, smoothing her coat. It matters very much, Miss Beadle. Thank you. Outside, the wind had picked up again. It rustled the leaves in dry whispers, as if the village itself were trying to speak, its secrets gathering momentum. Someone had returned to Flaxborough. Someone had carried a cup of tea into a clockmaker's shop. And someone had walked away, with a saucer and the truth. Miss Marple had just one more piece to place, but it would require delicacy and a quiet test, because the next move would not be hers. It would be the murderer's. It was just past noon when Flaxborough was rocked by a second shock. Word came swiftly from the church bell tower, where the parish caretaker, Samuel Little, had discovered the door to the inner stairwell ajar, a door that had always been kept bolted. He had gone up as usual to wind the bell mechanism, and there, beneath the ancient pulleys and weathered wooden beams, was Archie Frobisher, sprawled near the rope system, quite unconscious. Dr. Meredith was summoned immediately. Though Frobisher had not been killed, he had clearly been attacked. A bruise the size of a shilling bloomed behind his right ear, and his spectacles had been knocked several feet from where he lay. There was no sign of forced entry, no theft, and nothing missing, save for a brass service bell that had once hung on the wall, a detail so minor it might have been missed. The doctor's diagnosis was straightforward. Blunt force trauma, he told Inspector Leach. Could have been accidental if he fell, but more likely someone followed him up there. Leach's temper, already fraying, boiled over. Another attack? In a church, no less. And we still don't have answers about the first death. Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly at the vicarage upon hearing the commotion, said nothing at first. She watched from the edge of the nave, her eyes taking in not only the crime scene, but the people gathered nearby. Frobisher had not died, but someone had meant to silence him, or at least frighten him. "I want the names of anyone who's been in the church in the past 24 hours, Leach barked. "Caretakers, choir members, flower guild, parish volunteers, everyone." "I was arranging the altar flowers this morning," said Mrs. Langford calmly. "But I saw no one else inside apart from Samuel." Miss Marple moved closer, her expression composed. "Inspector, if I may?" Leach gave a tight nod. "I wonder," she said, "if Mr. Frobisher had come here to think." Leach frowned. "Think?" "Yes. After your interview, I suspect he was beginning to put something together. Or perhaps remember something. He had a connection to Mortimer. Finch, tenuous perhaps, but personal. And something made him uneasy. What would bring him here? Privacy, Miss Marple said gently. There are few places more secluded in Flaxborough at this hour than a bell tower. Leach considered that. "Do you believe the same person who killed Finch attacked Frobisher?" "I believe," she said slowly, "that whoever killed Finch has now become afraid of exposure, and fear makes people bold and sloppy." That evening, as Frobisher lay recovering in the vicarage under Dr. Meredith's supervision, Inspector Leach made another visit, this time to Miss Marple's sitting room, where a modest fire burned and tea had already been poured. "I suppose," he muttered, "you already have a theory." "Not a theory," Miss Marple replied, offering him a cup. "A series of observations, but something remains just out of reach, a final detail." He accepted the tea reluctantly. "You're not convinced it's Frobisher?" "Not in the
least. He's self-important and vain, yes, but not violent. Besides, whoever attacked him knew their way into the bell tower through the inner stair, not commonly used unless you're well acquainted with the church." Leach grunted. "Then—"
"We're back to the Beckets."
"Not we, Inspector. You. I've never stopped suspecting them." Leach looked up sharply. "They're gone. She's in Surrey." "Is she?" Miss Marple smiled. "And yet she was seen here in Flaxborough only a few days ago." Leach
stiffened. "Who saw her?" "Miss Beadle. Cynthia disguised herself, of course, but not well enough, and if she was here, she may never have left." He stood, pacing. "Then you believe she's still in the village, hiding?" "I believe she may be staying under another name, or else passing through with a rented room. Did you think to check the registry at the Thistle Arms or the boarding house?"
Leach gave her a long look. "I'm beginning to think I should have had you on the payroll." She smiled modestly and sipped her tea. The next day, Leach dispatched Riggs to inspect the guest registers across Flaxborough. By afternoon, they
had their answer. At the boarding house on Windermere Street, a Mrs. Claire Barston had checked in the night before Finch's death. Tall, elegant, quiet. Paid in cash. No luggage beyond a single valise. She had since checked out, but not before leaving behind a pair of gloves, and a train schedule marked with Finch's village, circled in blue ink. It was, of course, Cynthia Beckett. Leach was livid. "She was under our noses. Why return to Flaxborough? Why take the risk?" "To retrieve something," Miss Marple said. "Or to ensure something stayed hidden. That's the risk of forged antiques, Inspector. They carry memories that can be traced, and she knew Finch had discovered the deception. You believe she killed him to keep him quiet? I believe she offered him tea that she brought it herself. And when she left, she took the saucer, perhaps even the cup, then swapped it for another. Someone like her would know how to clean things properly. And the envelope under the floorboard? She didn't know about that, Miss Marple said, her eyes glinting. She assumed he had told no one. That he died with the secret. Leach pressed his lips together. "We still can't prove she was here that day." "No," Miss Marple replied. "But we can tempt her into proving it for us." That night she wrote a second letter, this time under the name of an anonymous collector who had allegedly purchased one of the Beckett's clocks and discovered inconsistencies. She included just enough detail to make the threat of exposure clear. The letter was left at the post office, addressed to a forwarding address Cynthia had used in her recent correspondence. The next evening, Miss Marple sat quietly on a bench, beneath the great elm near the old forge, knitting in her lap, though her eyes rarely moved from the narrow path beyond. At precisely 6:45 p.m., a figure appeared, tall, wrapped in a long coat, moving with precision but looking side to side too.
Often.
Cynthia Beckett. She passed by without seeing Miss Marple and continued toward the library, the location named in the letter as the meeting point for an exchange of documentation. Inside the library, Miss Beadle waited behind her desk, outwardly calm, but with Inspector Leach and Constable Riggs hidden behind the shelves. As Cynthia stepped in, a trace of tension in her shoulders, Miss Beadle said quietly, "Looking for something, Mrs. Beckett?" The woman froze, and when she turned, her expression had already begun to shift, first confusion, then defensiveness, then cold calculation. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Beadle said. "You've been expected," and from behind the shelves stepped Leach. The trap had been sprung. Outside, Miss Marple finished the last row of her shawl and folded her knitting with satisfaction. She didn't need to see what happened next. She already knew. Time at last had caught up with Cynthia Beckett. The next morning, Flaxborough stirred to life with a peculiar mix of anticipation and restraint. Word had spread, though unofficially, that Mrs. Cynthia Beckett had been questioned late into the evening at the police station. The village, in its characteristically polite manner, did not gossip outright, but conversations in the greengrocer's and murmured exchanges near the post office carried a distinct tension. Everyone sensed the end was drawing near. Miss Marple, however, remained quiet. She had not yet revealed all her thoughts, not to Inspector Leach, not to Dr. Meredith, and certainly not to Cynthia Beckett, because, as she well knew, there is a vast difference between catching someone in the act and making them confess to it. Guilt could be hidden with grace, but fear, true fear, had a way of loosening tongues. At precisely 11:30 that morning, Miss Marple arrived at the police station carrying a basket of currant buns wrapped in gingham. Constable Riggs, who had been rather on edge since the arrest, blinked at her. Miss Marple, this isn't—" "I've come to see Mrs. Beckett," she said serenely, "as an old acquaintance. Nothing official, of course." Leach appeared in the hallway before Riggs could protest further. He studied her for a moment, then gave a grudging nod. "She's not speaking much," he said as they walked toward the small interview room. "Denies everything, claims she was here for a personal errand, won't say what."
No mention of the clock, of Finch, nothing. "She's clever," Miss Marple said simply, "but cleverness and composure are not the same thing." Inside, the interview room was stark. A narrow table, 2 chairs, and a faint smell of damp.
Cynthia Beckett sat with her back straight and her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wore a dark wool coat and a look of calm disdain. "Miss Marple," she said, without a hint of warmth. "What a surprise!" Miss Marple placed the basket on the table. "I thought you might like a bun, currant, with a touch of nutmeg. You always liked those, didn't you?" "I don't recall." "Oh, memory is such a tricky thing, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, sitting opposite her. We forget small things, but we never quite forget important ones. Cynthia gave a humourless smile. And which important memory do you think I've forgotten? Miss Marple regarded her gently. The one where Mortimer Finch discovered that the clock you brought him was a forgery? And the other one, where you brought him tea to smooth things?
Over. Just a simple visit, nothing sinister. Until he said something, or perhaps didn't say something, that made you realize he intended to expose you.
Cynthia's hands did not move. Her lips remained a faint, unmoved line. Miss Marple went on, her voice quiet but assured. He was careful, Mortimer. More careful than you realized. He left behind notes. He kept one of the clock's internal pieces, engraved with your initials.
It was quite damning, really, but I don't think he meant to ruin you. I believe he merely wanted to understand why someone would go to so much trouble to create something so intricate and false. Still, Cynthia said nothing. Miss Marple
reached into her handbag and drew out a small silver disc, the same one recovered from beneath Finch's floorboards. She placed it gently on the table, where the light caught the delicate monogram. C.B. I imagine you have others like it, Miss Marple continued. Made to appear older than they are, useful in creating an illusion of authenticity, but this one was never meant to be part of a Lamson clock, was it? Cynthia looked down at the disc just once, then back at Miss Marple. That proves nothing. No, Miss Marple said. But your reaction might. She paused, then added, almost absently, Of course you weren't alone. Your husband, Harold, was
likely involved, perhaps even more than you, but he's not here, is he? Cynthia's eyes flickered. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. That's what you came back for, isn't it? Not the clock, not even the papers.
You came to make sure there was nothing left behind that could trace back to him. Because Harold wouldn't do well in prison. He never had your strength. There was a long, terrible silence. Then Cynthia spoke. Quietly. Measured. You're very good, Miss Marple. I'm very old, Miss Marple said kindly. Old enough to have seen good people make dreadful choices, and dreadful people hide behind polite smiles. But what I always remember is this. Truth is like a pendulum. Sooner or later, it swings back. Cynthia exhaled slowly. It was supposed to be simple. A forgery, yes, but harmless. Antique dealers do it all the time, patching together parts, inventing stories. Finch was never meant to get involved, but he noticed things he cared about. Truth in a way most don't. You confronted him. I tried to reason with him. I even offered to buy the clock back. But he'd already written to a contact in Bath. I knew it would ruin us. And so, Cynthia looked at her hands. I used aconite in his tea, just a touch. It wouldn't have been noticeable, not in that bitter black blend he drank. He didn't even flinch. And the saucer? I wiped it clean, took it with me. The cup I left. It was still warm when I placed it near him. She paused, and her voice dropped further. He looked so peaceful. It almost didn't feel like
murder.
But it was, Miss Marple said softly. A knock came at the door, and Leach entered, having heard enough. Cynthia straightened. I'll give you one thing, she said, meeting Miss Marple's gaze. You didn't trap me. I chose to walk in. No, Miss Marple said, standing. You chose to come back. And with that, Cynthia Beckett was led away, her footsteps even, composed, as if she were leaving a garden party rather than a police interrogation. Outside, the sky had begun to cloud. The first drops of rain spattered across the station windows. Flaxborough, after a week of hushed dread, would begin to breathe again. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her rose garden, where the last blooms clung stubbornly to their stems. She clipped a fading tea rose and carried it indoors, placing it beside her window. Dr. Meredith stopped by with a parcel of fresh scones. "It's over then?" he asked. "For the most part," she said, "though I imagine the Beckets will remain a cautionary tale at auction houses for years to come. And Finch? He'll be remembered as he was, a man of precision, dignity, and quiet principle. He didn't ask for trouble, but he refused to ignore a lie." "Much like someone else I know," Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I only noticed what others overlooked. That's all detective work is, really. Observation, patience, and understanding when people say far too little." As the evening drew in and the clock on her mantel resumed its gentle ticking, Miss Marple took up her knitting once more. The steet pattern was nearly finished, the final threads weaving into place. The case had been about time from the very beginning. And in the end, time had spoken. The next day dawned grey and solemn. A thin mist lay like gauze across the hedgerows and hung low over the village green, lending Flaxborough a hush that seemed almost reverent. Though the gossip had flared in full, following Cynthia Becket's arrest, it had now quietened into something closer to awe. The truth was spreading, gently but firmly, like ripples across still water. Miss Marple, having concluded her usual early stroll through the churchyard, was invited to a small private gathering at the vicarage. The vicar himself, Reverend Langford, had asked her to attend, as had Inspector Leach, who wished to formally acknowledge her assistance, though in truth he still wore the slightly embarrassed expression of a man outmanoeuvred by someone, wielding knitting needles instead of handcuffs. As Miss Marple entered the vicar's study, she was greeted by a curious collection of faces, Dr. Meredith, of course, and the vicar and his wife, Edith. Leach stood with arms crossed by the hearth, his tone clipped but respectful. Even young Constable Riggs was there, looking only slightly less flustered than usual. The final guest, seated stiffly in a corner chair and trying not to look offended, was Mr. Archie Frobisher. He gave a short nod to Miss Marple, avoiding her eye. "Miss Marple," Leach began, "we felt it appropriate to have you here, since it seems the matter is at last resolved." "I am very glad to hear it," she said pleasantly, removing her gloves and folding them into her lap. "Mrs. Becket confessed," Leach continued. "She's admitted to returning to Flaxborough under an alias, confronting Mortimer Finch, and administering aconite via a cup of tea. She intended to frighten him, she claims, not to kill him. But the dosage was fatal." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "That's nonsense, of course. Aconite is not subtle. It causes rapid cardiac symptoms, numbness, dizziness, and eventually collapse. Even a small dose is dangerous." "She knew what she was doing," Dr. Meredith confirmed quietly, "and she was relying on Mortimer's solitary habits to delay discovery. She returned to the boarding house, waited overnight, then slipped away before the body was found," Leach continued. "We confirmed her identity through handwriting comparison and fingerprints left on the brass bell she removed from the church tower, where she attacked Mr. Frobisher." Frobisher made a scoffing noise, though it was more wounded pride than indignation. Miss Marple looked at him with kind eyes. "I believe she struck you because you were close to remembering something, Mr. Frobisher, something that had been niggling in your mind since Mortimer's death." Yes," he admitted. "I'd remembered seeing her. Not recently, but months ago, just before she and Harold left. She came into my classroom, actually, delivering some library books on Miss Beadle's behalf. That's when I first noticed that strange clock she mentioned, the one she said had belonged to a viscount's estate." "The Lambson clock?" said Leach. Yes, she boasted about its value, but the mechanism was clearly a patchwork. My father was a horologist, and I know enough to spot a badly married case. It stayed in my mind, especially after Mortimer's death. I began to think she'd returned to silence him. That's why I went to the church tower, to think alone. You were right to be cautious, Miss Marple said. And lucky she didn't strike harder. She panicked, said Leach, afraid you might say something before she could slip away. She almost did, Riggs added. Train was due the next morning. Just 2 hours later, and she'd have vanished. But murder has a way of lingering, Miss Marple said softly, especially when committed in a place like Flaxborough. We do not forget here, and we notice things, tiny, trivial things, like the absence of a saucer or the smudging on a cuff, things that speak louder than confession. There was a quiet murmur of agreement. The vicar, who had remained mostly silent, now leaned forward. It's a sad business. To think she returned to do such harm. And for what? A clock? For a lie, Miss Marple corrected gently. A very elaborate lie, one she and her husband built together. The forgeries were clever. Many might not have noticed, but Mortimer Finch did. And once he had suspicions, he made inquiries. That was his mistake, if one can call it that. He believed truth mattered more than convenience. Which it does, said Edith Langford firmly. Even when it hurts. Miss Marple inclined her head. Quite so. But the truth is, rarely...
Tidy! You see, Cynthia Beckett did not act alone. She confessed only to protect Harold. That caused a stir. She's shielding him?
Leach asked, eyes narrowing. She's always been the more pragmatic of the two. Harold is more fragile. I suspect he pressured her, perhaps even insisted she handle the situation. But she planned it, carried it out, and returned to clean up. I doubt he'll ever know the full cost of it. So she sacrifices herself? She sees it as strategic, Miss Marple said. A lesser evil, and perhaps, somewhere deep down, a final act of loyalty, twisted but not uncommon in partnerships built on deceit. The room grew quiet, the weight of finality settling like dust. After some time, the vicar cleared his throat. And now, I suppose, we begin the task of returning to normal. Quite, said Dr. Meredith. Leach rose. There'll be a formal statement issued later this week. For now, we consider the case closed. Thank you, Miss Marple, again. She smiled politely, nodded to each in turn, and excused herself. Outside, the mist had lifted, and the church bell tolled the hour, a long, low chime that seemed to echo across the rooftops. Miss Marple paused to listen. She felt, as she always did at the end of a case, that peculiar mix of sadness and satisfaction. A life had been taken, a lie exposed, a truth restored. She took the long way home, through the garden path behind the bakery, where the last of the chrysanthemums drooped in the soft wind. The village felt different now, though outwardly it remained unchanged. That was the way with small places. Transformation happened quietly, like the shifting of gears behind a clock face. You didn't see it. You only felt the rhythm alter. As she reached her gate, Postman Jenkins tipped his cap. All quiet again, Miss Marple? For now, she replied, smiling. Though time, as ever, marches on. She stepped inside and set the kettle on the hob, the comforting sound of its simmer filling the room. Then she wound her mantel clock. 3. Gentle turns until the hands clicked into place. The ticking resumed, steady and true. A week had passed since Cynthia Beckett's quiet confession beneath the stern walls of the Flaxborough police station. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest now, sweeping in gusty swirls along the lanes and piling up against stone walls and hedgerows like nature's own attempt to blanket the village from memory. But Flaxborough, true to its nature, had begun to right itself with a kind of gentle resilience. The clockmaker's shop, though still shuttered, had lost its grim air. A simple wreath had been placed on the door. White lilies, tied with a ribbon of navy blue, Mortimer Finch's favourite colour, according to Mrs. Weatherby, who had taken it upon herself to ensure he was not forgotten. A notice posted by the vicar, with Edith Langford's careful calligraphy, announced that a memorial service would be held the following Sunday. A celebration of life and craft, it read, in honour of Mr. Mortimer Finch, keeper of time. The village had, for the most part, accepted Cynthia Beckett's guilt with quiet unease. No one delighted in her downfall. Flaxborough was not a cruel place, but there was a grim sort of understanding in how things had unfolded. Whispers suggested that Harold Beckett, still in Bath, had made no effort to retrieve his wife from custody or offer support. Others said he'd left the country. Miss Marple, of course, knew that he had likely remained silent because silence had always been his way. Let others do the risking. He would stay in the shadows, just out of reach. Still, the truth had been enough. The spell was broken. On Friday afternoon, Miss Marple was sitting in the garden of the Bluebell cottage, a tartan blanket draped over her knees and a pot of Earl Grey within easy reach. She had resumed her embroidery, delicate sprigs of lavender, along the hem of a tea-towel, but her mind, as always, remained slightly elsewhere. She was joined presently by Dr. Meredith, who arrived with a paper bag from the bakery and a quiet smile. "I brought apple turnovers," he said, "still warm." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said, folding her needlework. "Sit, won't you? It's still mild for October." He sat and poured himself a cup from the pot she'd already warmed. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before the doctor said, "I wonder sometimes what would have happened if Finch had said nothing, if he'd simply ignored the forgery." Miss Marple considered. He might still be alive, but it would have gone against his nature. Some people are simply not built to accept dishonesty, especially not in the things they care about. Dr. Meredith nodded. He was a good man. Not warm, perhaps, but good. Yes, and steady. There's something noble in steadiness, don't you think? They sat a while longer, the village moving gently in the distance. The sound of a distant cartwheel, children laughing by the green, and the occasional bark of a dog. Life, in all its ordinary rhythm, had returned. Later that evening, Miss Marple attended the rehearsal of the church choir, as she often did, though she never sang herself. She sat in one of the pews, knitting quietly, listening to the blend of sopranos and baritones under the vaulted ceiling of St. Jude's. The sound, imperfect but sincere, seemed to wash over the pews like balm. Mrs. Langford approached her afterward. "You'll be speaking at the service, won't you?" Miss Marple blinked. "Me?" You knew him better than most. He had no family, no close friends left here, but you always seemed to understand him. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. "Perhaps I did. Not because we spoke often, but because I've known many men like him. Observers, quiet thinkers, people who hold more than they ever let on." On Sunday, the chapel filled in a way it hadn't in years. Even those who had barely spoken to Mortimer Finch in life came to honour him in death. The shop remained closed, but its windows had been cleaned, and a single clock in the display, one that had once belonged to the village school, had been wound and set ticking again. A subtle, almost poetic touch. Miss Marple, standing at the front of the chapel, spoke simply and without flourish. "We often think of time as something we chase," she said, "something we are always behind. But Mortimer Finch was one of the few who met time on equal terms. He understood it, respected it. He mended what others forgot. He gave life back to the quiet ticking that marks our days. And in his final act, he honored truth above comfort. He was, in every sense of the word, a keeper, not just of clocks, but of integrity." Afterward, the townspeople gathered in the church hall for tea and scones, as was tradition. The mood was gentle, no joy but no sharp grief either. More like the closing of a long book one had read slowly, with care. Miss Beadle approached Miss Marple with a small wrapped parcel. "It was found in his shop," she said quietly, "among some ledgers. I believe he meant for you to have it." Inside the parcel was a small, beautifully polished desk clock. Simple in design, with delicate hands and a brass plate on the underside, engraved with the words, "For those who notice." Miss Marple ran her thumb across the engraving, and for a moment the chapel light caught the brass just so, making it shimmer. She looked up and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. That night, in her sitting room, Miss Marple placed the clock on the mantel beside her usual arrangement of violets. She wound it carefully, listening as the gears clicked gently into life. It ticked once, then again, and then settled into its rhythm, as if it had always belonged there. She sipped her tea and watched the firelight flicker across the walls. Another mystery solved, another truth restored, but not without cost. It never was. Outside, the wind stirred the last of the autumn leaves, sending them skittering down the lane. A new season was coming. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment and listened, not just to the ticking of the clock, but to the silence it gently broke. In that silence, she found something resembling peace. And so, in the village of Flaxborough, time moved on, steadily, honestly, without deception, just as Mortimer Finch would have wanted. It was 2 days after the memorial when Inspector Leach returned to Miss Marple's cottage, his hat in one hand and the last of the case paperwork in the other. Outside, Flaxborough had returned to itself. The postman was whistling again, Mrs. Weatherby had resumed her brisk morning walks with Bixby, and the village clock chimed faithfully every hour. Miss Marple, seated at her writing desk with her teacup still steaming beside her, looked up with a gentle smile. "I've come to close the file," Leach said. "Officially, Cynthia Beckett will be charged. There's enough evidence now to see it through, and we've reason to believe the forged antiques network may go deeper than just her and Harold." "I suspected as much," said Miss Marple, gesturing to the armchair near the hearth. "Would you like some tea? It's lapsang this time, rather smoky." He sat down with a tired sigh. "You were right, you know. About the timing, the saucer, the missing clock piece, all of it. And yet what still puzzles me is how you knew." Before she said a word, Miss Marple smiled almost wistfully. "Oh, I didn't know, Inspector, not in the forensic sense, but I recognized the pattern." Leach raised an eyebrow. "The pattern?" "Of guilt, of fear. You see, murderers very rarely act without showing something of themselves. It might not be visible to the eye, but they betray themselves through small things, discomfort in silence, carelessness in planning, or, in Cynthia's case, an unwillingness to ask questions." She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "When I sent that letter as Miss Haythorne, I expected some reply. Either curiosity, confusion, or defensiveness. Cynthia gave none. That told me more than any signed confession ever could. She knew exactly what I was referring to because she'd lived with the secret ever since Mortimer Finch uncovered it. Leach nodded slowly. And the saucer? Ah, Miss Marple said, and that was the truest clue of all. Mortimer was meticulous, not fussy, not prissy, just orderly. The kind of man who would never drink tea without a saucer. It wasn't an eccentricity, it was ritual to find a teacup. Without one, well, it screamed of outside interference. Leach let out a low whistle. And the envelope beneath the floorboard? An act of quiet courage, she said. He suspected something might happen. That letter wasn't just insurance, it was a testament. Mortimer wasn't a loud man, but he was not the sort to back down from truth. And that, I believe, was
what doomed him. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling in the hearth. Do you think Harold will ever be brought in? Leach asked eventually. Perhaps, Miss Marple said. But people like Harold rarely come into the light, unless forced. Cynthia protected him, even when she shouldn't have. I believe she made her peace with that in the end.
Leach sipped his tea, considering her words. Then, standing, he said, You know, Miss Marple, I may not say it often, but your help in this case, well, it was more than helpful. It was decisive. She looked up with a faint twinkle in her eyes. Oh, I only noticed what others missed. It's rather like embroidery, Inspector. One must look for the irregular stitch. It always gives the whole pattern away. With a chuckle and a nod, Leach tipped his hat and departed, leaving Miss Marple alone once more. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Flaxborough's hills, casting the cottages in soft amber light, Miss Marple wound the small desk clock that had been left to her in Mortimer's name. It ticked with the same calm certainty she had come to associate with. The man himself, neither loud nor intrusive, but present, steady. The mystery had unravelled, thread by thread. The forgeries, the lies, the fear, all laid bare by quiet truths and quiet people. And as the clock on her mantel struck 7, Miss Marple poured another cup of tea and returned to her chair by the window. There were no accolades, no grand speeches, only the sound of ticking, the gentle clink of porcelain, and the knowledge that justice, like time, had found its proper course. And in Flaxborough, peace had returned, for now.